The classroom in Munich echoed with the rhythmic chant of 30 children reciting multiplication tables. Albert sat at the back, his focus locked onto the complex swirling grain of the wooden desk. He did not speak. He did not sway with the rhythm of the room. He traced a single line of the wood with his thumbnail, mapping its path as if it were a road leading elsewhere. The teacher stopped mid-sentence. The chant faltered, then died out into a heavy, expectant silence. A wooden ruler struck the chalkboard with a sharp, dry crack that made the other children flinch. The teacher pointed the ruler directly at Albert, but he did not look up. He remained still, his breathing shallow, his mind elsewhere. The teacher sighed, a sound of frustration that cut through the room, and dismissed him with a sharp wave. "A slow learner," the teacher declared, the words echoing off the high, sterile walls. Albert did not react. He did not defend himself. He simply continued to trace the grain of the wood, his world entirely contained within the pattern under his fingers, indifferent to the judgment raining down from the front of the room. Albert walked home, the silence of the street mirroring the silence he maintained in the classroom. He sat on the edge of his bed, his finger tracing the repetitive, ornate patterns of the wallpaper. The door opened. His father entered, moving with a heavy, deliberate step, and placed a small brass object onto the blanket. It was a compass. Albert reached out, his hand hovering for a second before he touched the cool metal. He watched the needle swing, a frantic, rhythmic dance that suddenly ceased, locking firmly toward the north. He held his breath. He tilted the compass to the left, then to the right, but the needle remained anchored, defying the movement of his hand. It pointed to a destination he could not see, pulled by a force he could not feel. He looked up at his father, his eyes widening as he pointed to the needle. The frustration of the classroom vanished, replaced by an intense, burning curiosity. That night, he pushed his standard textbooks aside. By the flickering light of a single candle, he began to sketch diagrams of invisible lines and unseen currents, mapping the hidden architecture of the world that the teacher had never mentioned. The heavy oak doors of the university remained bolted, leaving Albert standing on the pavement with his ambitions folded in his pockets. Years passed in a blur of closed gates and silent libraries. He eventually walked into a government building in Bern, the air thick with the smell of ink and damp paper. The office was a labyrinth of gray corridors and narrow, sunless rooms. He was led to a cramped desk, tucked into a corner far from the windows. His supervisor dropped a stack of heavy files in front of him with a dull thud that vibrated through the floorboards. This was his world now. He spent his hours processing patent applications for clock mechanisms, electrical switches, and gear ratios. The work was repetitive, a cycle of stamping and filing that demanded nothing more than mechanical obedience. Albert sat in the dim light, the silence of the office pressing against his temples. He felt the weight of the desk, the monotony of the stamps, and the slow drain of the clock on the wall. The mediocrity of the room seemed designed to grind his thoughts into dust, a quiet prison built to ensure that no one ever looked beyond the surface of the machines they operated. The rhythm of the stamp became a metronome for his mind. Thump, lift, ink, thump, lift, ink. Albert sat hunched over the desk, his eyes scanning the technical diagrams of a new clock mechanism. He processed the applications with mechanical precision, but his hand moved with a different purpose. When the supervisor turned his back, Albert pulled a discarded draft from the trash bin. He smoothed the crumpled paper against the wood. With a stub of graphite, he began to sketch. He did not write sentences. He wrote the language of the universe. Equations sprouted in the margins, wrapping around the technical specs of electrical switches and gear ratios. He calculated the speed of light against the tick of a clock, his mind racing through dimensions while his body remained tethered to the desk. When the supervisor walked past, Albert casually dropped a blank application over his notes, his heartbeat echoing in the quiet room. The man paused, checked the stack, and nodded, never suspecting that the clerk was dismantling the foundations of physics beneath his very nose. Albert waited for the footsteps to fade, then lifted the paper again, his hand moving faster, carving the truth into the back of government forms until the ink ran dry. The stack of discarded forms grew until it reached the edge of the desk. Albert stopped stamping. He pulled the 4 finished papers from their hiding place and laid them out in a row. The edges were uneven, stained with ink, but the lines of logic were absolute. He spent the afternoon rereading his own proof, checking the variables of time and energy against the constraints of reality. There was no sound in the office except for the occasional scratch of a pen from the neighboring cubicle. He gathered the sheets, squared the corners, and tapped them against the wooden surface. The weight of the bundle felt heavy, as if the paper itself held the mass of a star. He tied the papers together with a thin strip of twine, his fingers steady. The air in the room seemed thin, vibrating with the potential of what he had authored. He looked at the final page, where the relationship between matter and energy had finally collapsed into a single elegant truth. He did not move. He waited for the end of the shift, the papers resting on his lap like a dormant charge. The mundane office, the clicking clocks, and the gray walls were about to be rendered obsolete by the 4 sheets of paper resting in his hand. Albert walked across the creaking floorboards. He reached the supervisor's desk and laid the tied bundle down. The supervisor did not look up from his ledger. He reached out a hand, pushed the bundle aside, and continued scratching his pen. Albert waited. He did not speak. He simply nudged the papers back toward the center of the desk. The supervisor sighed, dropped his pen, and unknotted the twine. He flipped through the first 3 pages with practiced indifference, but his thumb stopped on the final sheet. He leaned in. The scratching of pens in the room ceased. The supervisor looked up at Albert, his face pale, then looked back at the single line. E equals mc squared. The relationship between mass and energy was no longer a theory. It was a physical certainty written in ink. The supervisor slowly stood up, pushing his chair back with a sharp scrape against the floor. He stared at the formula as if it were a bomb. The laws of physics that had governed the world for centuries fractured in that silence. Albert stood perfectly still, watching the supervisor struggle to process the math. The world outside the window remained the same, but the reality behind it had been rewritten. The era of the clockmaker was over. The era of the atom had begun. The lecture hall echoed with the sound of hundreds of hands striking together. The vibration traveled through the floorboards and up into the soles of his feet. Albert stood at the podium. He did not look at the crowd. He did not acknowledge the standing ovation. He reached into his side pocket and pulled out a small, worn notebook. The leather cover was creased from years of pressure. He opened it to a blank page and uncapped his pen. The applause reached a crescendo, but he was already drifting away, his eyes fixed on the point of his pen as it touched the paper. He began to draw a series of interconnected curves, mapping the invisible geometry of gravity. The crowd shouted his name, but he did not turn toward the sound. He adjusted his stance, leaning his weight against the heavy wooden podium to steady his hand. The noise of the room became a distant, muffled hum. He scribbled a variable, crossed it out, and wrote it again with more force. The ink bled into the grain of the paper. To the audience, he was the center of the world. To himself, he was still the child in the Munich classroom, chasing an invisible pull through the dark. He kept writing, ignoring the light, the cheers, and the heavy weight of the fame that pressed against his shoulders. The letter lay flat on the desk, the ink still wet. Albert held the pen, his fingers rigid against the barrel. He had written the words that would ignite a race, a competition of physics turned into a weapon. He set the pen down. It rolled to the edge of the desk and clicked against the wood. The room felt smaller now, the air thick with the weight of the implications. He stood up, pushing his chair back with a slow, grinding sound. He walked to the window. Outside, the sky was a flat, indifferent gray. He pressed his palms against the cold glass, his eyes scanning the horizon. He did not look at the papers on his desk anymore. He looked at the space where the world might change, where the equations he had once scribbled in joy could manifest as destruction. The silence in the room was absolute. He remained there, unmoving, watching the light fade from the clouds. The theories he had unlocked were no longer his own. They had escaped into the hands of men who would build fires that could reach the stars. He stood as a witness to his own creation, waiting for the echo of his decisions to return from the world beyond the glass. The frantic pace of the world receded, replaced by the rhythmic crunch of leaves underfoot. Albert walked through the Princeton woods, his pace slow, his head bowed. He stopped by a fallen oak, tracing the deep fissures in the bark with a steady finger, just as he had traced the wood grain in Munich decades before. The forest offered no answers, only the constant, quiet movement of shadows. He turned back toward the house, his breath hitching in the cold air. Inside, his office remained a sanctuary of chaos. Stacks of paper climbed the walls, topped with scribbled notations and half-finished derivations. He sat at the desk, pulled a fresh sheet forward, and set his pen to the surface. He worked until the ink ran dry. He did not look up when his hand finally slowed, nor when the pen slipped from his fingers to clatter against the wood. The room grew still. The sunlight shifted across the floorboards, leaving the desk in shadow. He remained seated, his eyes fixed on the final equation, an unfinished bridge between the known and the infinite. He had spent his life chasing the light, and in the silence of the room, he finally let the search reach its end. High above the tree line, a hiker stands on a jagged peak, wind whipping against his face. He pulls a small device from his pack and taps the screen. A signal pulses from orbit, traveling thousands of miles to reach his hand. The device calculates his position with impossible precision, adjusting for the very warping of time that Albert mapped in his cramped office in Bern. The satellite overhead maintains its orbit by the grace of those same equations, correcting for the curve of space that Albert first glimpsed in a compass needle. The math is not theoretical anymore. It is the pulse of the modern world. Every movement, every flight path, every digital map relies on the insights of the man who once sat silent in a classroom, ignored by his peers. The world labeled him a slow learner, yet he mastered the language of the stars. He reached into the dark and pulled out the fundamental architecture of reality. The signals continued to travel, crossing the void between satellites and handheld screens, proving that the quietest mind in the room had the power to rewrite the laws of the universe forever.